This is a tide pool area, the intertidal zone at Carpinteria State Park, just north of Los Angeles, California. So these are tide pools where you can find lots of species of animals and plants and algae that live. Now, you can see there's all kinds of limpets and barnacles. You can find crabs in the crevices. You can find anemones, sometimes sea stars, but they're usually a little bit further out. And the ocean waves will come in, pound the rocks. So species living here have to be highly adapted to all kinds of conditions. There's a green anemone right there, and surrounded by mussels, more anemones, sea lettuce, which is a green algae, limpets, barnacles up here, all kinds of species. And when the tide is out, you get pools of water that are really quite warm from the sun, and here's anemones here. So this water is warm, and so these species have to be adapted to warm water. And then when the tide comes in and it's covered in water, it cools down because the ocean water here in California is quite cold. It's probably about 65 degrees Fahrenheit right now in the middle of summer. So one thing to notice here in tide pools is that tides come in and tides go out. We are about mid-tide, so right in between low and high tide. When it's low tide, the water goes way out. In fact, it's pretty close to low tide. It's 4 p.m. Low tide here is 5 p.m., so this is pretty low. Today is the low tide at 5 p.m. And you can see most of this is uncovered. But when high tide comes in, the water comes up and covers all of these rocks all the way up to maybe here. So all of this is covered in water during high tide. So if you are going to map biodiversity, we've got species that are going to live more in this high tide zone here or closer to the shore. So when it's high tide, the water covers them. And then you've got species that kind of live in the middle and species that live further out. And species that live further out are going to be covered in water more frequently. So here you can see those species out there are going to be covered in more water, but not always in water, depending on how high the tide is or how low the tide is. So scientists will want to know which species kind of live in which zone or what area, from the low tide mark way out there to the highest tide mark up here. And depending on the gravitational pull of the moon, you may have the high tide may go way up onto the shore or may go up a little ways onto the shore, depending on how much or little the gravitational pull of the moon is. And the same with the low tides may expose more rock or less rock. So this is how tide pools work with low and high tides. And you've got variations of temperature. You've also got variations of salinity too, as the tide comes in and out.